questions that I often get teaching a course in environmental economics and policies. Students just wondering, not sure how economists fit in to try to solve environmental and natural resource problems. And so what I'd like to do is just go through an example, an important example, climate change. And the goal here is just to give you a taste of where economists fit in, the roles or the hats that the hats they wear, the roles that they play. And so a question that used to be interesting, and no longer is the question of, is climate change happening? Or two questions: is it happening? And is it because of human reliance on fossil fuels, because of human activity more generally? And the answer to that question is yes. Again, the questions I'm asking: is climate change happening? You can see that, and because of human activity. The answer to these questions is yes. We have 197 countries that party to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, part of the Paris Agreement, and all of their major scientific bodies support that. The answer to this is yes. Now, the fact that it's happening is because, in part, because humans' reliance on fossil fuels doesn't tell us what to do about it. What should we do about it? And so economists, the first role economists play in this climate change issue is this idea of measuring or creating a framework for understanding how well society is doing. We call this social welfare, right? So this is we'll put a star here. This is an economist's role, is conceptualizing how well society is doing, okay? And part of this is going to be understanding benefits and costs of activities. And if we're talking about, and we're going to be talking about, reducing greenhouse gases, right, the major contributor to climate change, we're going to have some benefits of doing that, right? We're going to have some costs of doing that, right? And it's this balancing act that economists help inform of what's optimal. What's the optimal thing to do, right? And our optimal, or the economist's optimal, may be different from other disciplines. That's fine. That's what makes the world an interesting place. But in this class, we're going to talk about this idea of social welfare and how, given some environmental problems, we could do better as a society, reducing greenhouse gases, reducing pollution more generally. And so that certainly is an economist's role, is that idea of social welfare. Then we're talking about costs and benefits of, and I'll put this here in parentheses, in the context of our problem, of reducing greenhouse gases. Right? Through all the mechanisms we can do this, there are costs and benefits of doing this. And I put a star here because economists play a major role here, right? A major role here in terms of identifying and measuring, right? Measuring these costs and benefits and quantifying, right? Or monetizing, right? Monetizing these costs and benefits. And these are sometimes really tricky things to do, right? Sometimes we're talking about reduced health risks or mortality. We're talking about these values of another day of, an asthmatic day for someone with asthma because of, pollution problems, or just increased mortality from extreme weather events and a global, higher global mean temperature. We could be talking about displacement of people or entire societies on small island nations, right? That just have to completely, be uplifted and move somewhere else, or coastal communities that have to move inland. And what I'm talking about now, or those examples are benefits of avoiding more climate change, or you could also think about those as damages for not doing anything about this, and all those things, agricultural problems, And on the flip side, some of the costs are these switching costs, right? It may be more expensive to heat your home if we can't rely on fossil fuels, if the price of fossil fuels go up. It may be, expensive infrastructure to put all charging stations to move our transportation from fossil fuel based to EV. All these things, and some are short term, some are long term, and all of these things have to be monetized and quantified. And some of the measuring could just be through, observational data, right? Maybe we have data on, weather, and we have data on health, or responses to extreme weather, and we can kind of use that to forecast or predict, some implications, let's say on the health side from a warming climate. Some things aren't as easy as that, and we have to have kind of other tools. And economists, another, let's pop this up here, another star. Another role that economists play is developing tools to quantify non-market values. Right? What's the, if one of the implications is loss in biological diversity or even species extinction, what's the value of that? How do we value the loss of biological diversity? How do we value potential loss in a nice view or a recreational area or clean water, all these kind of things? Sometimes it's not as easy as just looking at kind of market data, because often we're talking about degrading resources that aren't bought and sold on a market, right? And so we have, economists have developed things called stated preference techniques. Right? These are often called contingent valuation, where we ask people their willingness to pay, right, to move from one state of the world to another, or willingness to pay to improve environmental quality of some resource, or quality of a resource from point A to point B. And so we're kind of looking for what are these values, these improvements or conservation exercises. We have revealed preference techniques, right? And these could be hedonic methods or travel cost methods, right? And these are the kind of techniques where you say, well, let's use data that we have to try to get at a value for something that we typically don't monetize, like the value of a public park. And so hedonic methods may use housing data and try to control for everything else: the size of the house, where it was built, the materials, the square footage, the lot size, and try to tease out what's the implication of essentially an equivalent house but being close to a park, or being close to a park with cleaner, water. And you can, depending on the data that you have and how focused the question is, you can use these techniques to get this. Travel costs is, what are people willing to pay to go visit a national park? What are, and that's just, it's not just, the cost of gas or whatever, but the hotel and the eating out and all this is part of the cost that people are willing to pay to enjoy an environmental or natural resource. And so we can kind of back that out. And the point is that economists have helped develop these techniques, and they're important for asking this question of what's the optimal, what should we do about this, right? And so this is certainly an important hat that economists have. Okay, so we sketched out the idea of the cost and benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions or improving the environment more generally, and the important role economists play in kind of developing tools to measure those things and actually doing it, right? And those are kind of those positive economic questions of what is. Now, those costs and benefits can help us decide what our, say, environmental, in this case climate, goals are, right? Or our goal, right? By, it could be reducing emissions in the current Paris Agreement, right, to avoid an increase in temperatures above pre-industrial levels of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And whatever that goal is, the next kind of role economists play are to design, to help design and evaluate, right, through those kind of techniques we talked about, through usually econometrics and data analysis, policies. All right, I'll put another star here, pop up another star, and institutions, right, kind of rules that we play by to achieve, design and value policies and institutions to achieve our goals, all right, those environmental goals. And so whatever is used to determine this, and again, cost-benefit analysis is certainly going to play some role, but whatever that goal is, economists play another important role in trying to help design and evaluate these policies. And again, that can be mostly through data analysis or what we call econometrics. Some of the policies that we look at in this course is, the simplest form of regulation, command and control, are kind of rules-based. These are standards. You can think of them as emission standards or pollution standards. These are kind of laws, and they would be implemented at a a consumer level or a firm level. And most of the regulation in this country under the Clean Water Act would fall into the command and control. It just tells you what you can do, right? If you're an electric utility, you can't emit more than X metric tons of sulfur dioxide or something like that. And so that's kind of like a baseline level of regulation of just telling firms and or people what they can and cannot do. Economists almost universally prefer what are called market-based mechanisms or market-based policies. And these are policies where we're going to try to tweak, either a non-existent market or a non-function or a poorly functioning market, so that people make the right decisions, and the right decisions mean decisions that correspond to our environmental goals. And some ways we do that, you could think of, you may have heard of carbon taxation, right? And this is trying to put a price on something like fossil fuel use that emits greenhouse gases, is that people aren't paying the full price of that. And so carbon taxes, we talk about permits, tradable permits, we could talk about subsidies, right? This is kind of reducing the cost, or this is increasing the cost, reducing the cost of doing a good thing, increasing the cost of doing a bad thing, let's say. We've got voluntary programs that economists have explored, and what are those incentives that exist in voluntary programs? We look at international policies, that says international, promise me, I promise you, agreements. Right, international agreements are going lowercase, I'm going uppercase, we're going crazy over here. We also look at behavioral, we'll call these nudges, behavioral nudges. These are things that, we recognize that people respond not just to prices, not just to market incentives, but they respond to peer comparisons. They respond to shame. People respond to doing the right thing, to norms, to focal points, to fitting in, to all these things. And so there's quite a bit of work, and this is kind of a growing field, of how do you nudge people or firms or societies to do the right thing. And sometimes these things aren't as costly, right? Sometimes they're just kind of small tweaks to existing institutions or infrastructure, and you can get some pretty important results. So anyway, to conclude this, economists play another role in designing and evaluating policies to achieve our goals. All right, I want to make one more point about the role economists play in managing climate change. And the first is to recognize that climate change is a global environmental problem. And this is important because we have a collection of countries that are sovereign without some sort of global governmental system that can dictate what needs to happen. And so you have what's called a collective action problem. Right? And these kind of problems are usually characterized by there's a gap between what's individually optimal and what's collectively optimal. Right? So it may individually be optimal for a country, to keep relying on fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels, using cheap refrigeration, whatever the case may be, because individually it would increase their productivity, their GDP, whatever the measure is. But collectively, right, all those external costs imposed on the rest of the globe, it would be collectively better to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And so that's the definition of a collective action problem. Not necessarily as big of an issue domestically when you have maybe a regulator that can come in and enforce an institution. But between countries, it really needs to be voluntary. And so that's why we have international environmental agreements like the Paris Agreement to try to address this, right? Now, the role that economists play certainly is trying to conceptualize these. We often use game theory, right, for us to understand strategic implications like addressing climate change. And this idea that it may be individually better to do something that is at odds with what's collectively ideal. And tests of game theory, or the implications of game theory, using economic experiments. Usually, these can be done in a laboratory, they can be done in the field, all different kind of ways you can do experiments. But experiments offer a kind of a way, in a controlled fashion, just like any scientific experiment, us to get a glimpse of what the effect of a certain treatment is. And that treatment may be a policy, and we can take a policy to a lab and see how it plays out in kind of a sterile environment that could give insight to regulators before they actually go through the effort of imposing or implementing regulation. We can see how firms or people respond to taxation, to subsidies, to permit trading. And so economists, and I'll pop another star here, utilize these tools, often together, to try to get better insight on what are the implications of these collective action problems, how can we try to resolve them, what are some of the either behavioral nudges or policies that can be used, how can we structure international agreements in a way that may be effective. And so a lot of economists concentrate on that theoretical analysis to try to get insight, and many, including myself, on economic experiments that try to test these theories. All right, so at least that is kind of a broad brush introduction of the roles that economists can play in addressing environmental problems like climate change.